Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed your lunch, and we are very happy to continue our discussion of security and partnerships in the Gulf. I have the great honor to introduce Vice Admiral Brad Cooper. He is the commander of U.S. Naval Forces in U.S. Central Command, the guy who runs the U.S. Navy in the Gulf and in the Red Sea and in the Arabian Sea. He has a long and illustrious career around the world. He is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. He has commanded 2 ships over his time, and he has had positions in the White House, in the Pentagon, and also as the Navy's chief legislative liaison to the U.S. Congress. He was also the recipient of the Admiral Elmo Zumwalt Award for Visionary Leadership, but I can see why he got that award, and you'll see that in just a few moments. We've been talking about the importance of partnership and the definition of security, and I think that having Admiral Cooper here will be a very vital contribution to our perception and the ideas of how the United States and the countries of the Gulf can cooperate. So, Admiral, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Fantastic, fantastic. Real honor and privilege for me to be here. And as I was speaking to the ladies, really to be back here in Abu Dhabi. I come here quite frequently. My one mortal sin is I haven't been taking my wife. So I'm working on this. We're all working on things in terms of our relationship. This is one of the things that I'm working on. But sir, thank you for the kind introduction and for all the distinguished leaders here. Thank you for your lifetime of service to all our respective countries that we serve today. I really want to focus my remarks today on, for about 10 minutes, on a regional perspective of and some optimism for security and prosperity. And then when we're done, of course, we'll transition into some Q&A. But if I could just lead in with a couple of broad statements, and that is, I think the oceans of the world have long served as pathways for cooperation among states. This has been well established for many decades. And the vastness and the central role of the sea in particular in global trade and where that plays relative to international policy, foreign policy, has always been important. And clearly we see this in the Middle East region today. 2 years ago, the United Arab Emirates made history as a signatory of the Abraham Accords. And as we have seen since then, there have been tremendous gains, particularly in the area of regional maritime security. Last year, for instance, our Emirati partners joined with us, Bahrain, and Israel and conducted the first of its kind naval exercise in the Red Sea. This marked a first and I think a significant step forward. It was encouraging and certainly exciting to see and be a part of. Then this year, we conducted the region's largest international maritime exercise. It's called IMX, International Maritime Exercise. We keep it simple around here. And Emiratis played an enormous, and I would say outsized role in the leadership of one of the large task forces. And in this exercise, there were 60 countries and organizations, which is the largest of its kind in the world. I think this really does reflect a tremendous unity that is able to be forged at sea among nations. And I'm proud to say, as a result of that and other things I'll discuss, I'm quite optimistic that this region is on a trajectory of strengthening and expanding regional cooperation among countries. Today, our naval forces here in the Middle East are focused on the promise and possibilities of strengthening our partnerships and accelerating innovation. These are 2 topics I'll talk about repeatedly. These are the themes of the things that I'll address. And by doing so, I think we can both increase our deterrence and increase our ability to respond should a malign activity or, in a worst-case scenario, combat operations ever ensue. So if I just zoom out just a bit, I think that we would all agree that this region is vast and dynamic. The distance from the Suez Canal all the way around the Arabian Peninsula is about 8,000 kilometers. This distance alone from the Suez Canal down to Bab el-Mandeb is about the distance from Boston to Miami. It is a long way. And because the distances are so long and the seas are so vast, there's no one Navy that can possibly patrol it on its own. It requires a team effort, and we certainly have this today. That team member in particular is focused on securing the three major choke points: Suez Canal, Bab el-Mandeb, and Strait of Hormuz. This has been the case for many years, and it remains a focus today. How we do it is something I'll talk about. Clearly, the threats that commercial shipping have faced over the years are well reported and have ranged widely, from unwarranted attacks of piracy to state-sponsored acts, like we've seen in just the last couple of days. I'm happy to talk about that. And in such a dynamic and vast environment, we must team together. We must partner together in order to protect together. I think that's important. Of course, in the Navy, I have a bias. I'm always going to want to talk about ships. They're my favorite thing to talk about. But if anyone ever asks me what the most important ships are that we have deployed here today, it's a very easy answer. And there are four of them. There are four of them specifically, and it'd be something that I'd ask you that you leave this conversation with. And they are relationships, partnerships, woven together by leadership, and sprinkled in with friendship. These are by far the most important ships that we sail with every single day. If I could talk a little bit about our relationship with UAE in particular, we conducted our largest bilateral exercise back in June. It was called Iron Defender. Our forces rehearsed maritime security, mine countermeasures, harbor defense, patrolling of large areas of water, and this clearly deepened what is already a long-standing and strategic relationship that goes back decades. There's a couple of firsts that we achieved. It's the first time that we had U.S. ships in several years connect with one another via an electronic data link and share information on a real-time basis. That's a very positive step forward. And then it's one thing to just spend all your time blowing things up, which we're eminently capable of doing. We practice this all the time. It's a whole other thing to get a little bit more in-depth and sophisticated by using soft power, which we have a general orientation and preference for. And we were able to do this with the Emirati military, with our civil affairs teams practicing together. 2 months after that, we hosted several Emirati officers at our headquarters in Bahrain, where we talked about the future. And part of that future is in unmanned technology. In fact, UAE was one of the countries that contributed more than 80 unmanned systems on, above, and below the water during this large IMX exercise. So strengthening and expanding our cooperation by the integration of these unmanned systems, coupled, and this is a very important point, with artificial intelligence, is of critical importance to both of our forces. And I will tell you here today that I believe that our maritime operations, based on where we are with unmanned systems and artificial intelligence, I believe that we are on the cusp of a technological revolution. This would be a vast integrated network of manned and unmanned sensors from seabed to space to surface. In fact, this isn't decades from now. The technology exists today, and we're using it as we all sit here. It's very exciting. A few weeks ago, we completed a naval drill in the Gulf featuring the use of unmanned systems and artificial intelligence during operations with 7 crewed ships from us and regional partners, including UK, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. We tested how our forces can work together using advanced drones to monitor the surrounding seas. And during these maneuvers, 3 of our unmanned surface vessels, or USVs, I should just talk about these for just a moment. So I think we've all recognized that for the better part of 30 years, we've had UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. They're in the air. They've been flying for a while. For about a decade, we've had UUVs, unmanned undersea vehicles. But the technology for unmanned surface is only about 15 months old in its maturity and autonomy, and we're using it here today. So we, in this exercise, had 3 of these USVs with cameras. They have sensors, they have artificial intelligence. They're interestingly controlled by an operator that sits in San Francisco, California, and it's controlled by satellite. You can just imagine these drones out on the water detecting everything that moves, and they use artificial intelligence to map everything that is around them. And when there's something different outside the pattern of life, every second they'll begin to take a picture of whatever that is and send it back to a human operator in an operations center. And then a human being ultimately makes the decision on what to do. Is it a fishing boat? Okay, that's relatively simple. Is it a hostile Navy ship? That's relatively simple also. And then there's all the things in between it could be. In the absence of having those eyes on the sea, in the overwhelming majority of 8,000 kilometers around the Arabian Peninsula, we would otherwise have no idea what would be happening. So I think it's easy for you to see how having what I refer to as an extra set of eyes on the water in the form of unmanned surface vessels, being able to integrate, use artificial intelligence, and communicate is both an efficiency and I think an imperative for maritime security. We will be able to deter more, we'll be able to see more, and we'll be able to act more effectively and more vibrantly as we do so. And I think this is important, an important point as we stay ahead of all the competitors, throughout the world. So if I look back about 15 months ago when we knew that this technology existed and we could do something with it, we moved quickly. We established a new organization called Task Force 59. It's probably the most frequently written about task force among those that we lead in the Middle East. And in this regard, we were looking to take an opportunity of how would we use this new and emerging unmanned technology with artificial intelligence and move it forward quickly. Anyone involved in the United States acquisition processes would generally recognize that the word quickly is not the term that's of art that is used, although there are certainly some examples of rapid fielding technologies. In our case, we weren't looking for years or decades to field something. We were looking for weeks or months. So we set off on a very rapid path in what we would refer to as a factory-to-fleet approach, where we brought in a suite of unmanned surface vessels, brought them out to sea, and started launching into this journey of discovery and learning, where we had successes and made mistakes, learned from them quickly, and iterated in a model that we generally refer to as scan, test, iterate, and deploy. In practical terms, we have a lot of really mostly young, but some people my age, which are still young, of course, folks who are scanning the environment for the latest technology. We bring it in the theater and we test it. When it works, we iterate it quickly. If it doesn't work, we don't spend another second on it. There's no sense wasting time on technology that's just not going to work, even if you spend $5 billion and try to invest in it. After we test it and we get to a point and we iterate on it, we then deploy it. Let me give you a couple of examples of how we do this. And as we do this along the way, our focus is on speed. This is an imperative. We're working in terms of weeks and months, not years. So using this model, we've been able to take a network called a mesh network, which takes nodes that are secure and that can operate in a communications denied environment, meaning if it's heavily jammed, and they're all connected together. It's a self-healing network. If one goes down, the network heals itself and reconnects. Pretty high-end technology. In a period of about 60 days, we iterated on this technology 4 times. First, we conducted a bilateral exercise with the Saudis, iterated on it once, literally a week with the company who owns it. The next week, we iterated on it again with a bilateral exercise with the Jordanians up in the Gulf of Aqaba. The next week, we iterated on it again in a bilateral exercise with the Israelis. 10 days later, we iterated on it again in an exercise in NATO off the coast of Portugal, in which we actually linked with Starlink to increase our speed. Guess what? It all works. From the start to the finish was a period of about 45, 50 days, and we got ourselves to a point of high-end, mature communications that will now be tested in the coming weeks, starting next week in an exercise called Digital Horizon, which will be the largest unmanned exercise that we have here in this particular region. So I'm excited about it. And so if you take that, though, and look at what the future looks like, I would describe it as bright, optimistic, and exciting. Based on achievements to date, we've set a goal that by the end of summer of 2023, we would have 100 unmanned surface vessels patrolling the waters of the Middle East. About 20% of them would be from the United States. 80% would be spread among all our friends in the region. And we're moving out rapidly on this. And so this is where I go back to the 4 most important ships. It's the partnerships, relationships, and friendships, and that leadership that goes into bringing those together. And the reason that's important is because every one of these sensors in the world of maritime security can bring information together in a model that we would just call a digital ocean. It's what I call an intelligent synthesis of around-the-clock inputs from seabed to space to surface, and everything in between, all connected and coming together on a single pane of glass so that human beings can make a decision on what to do with it using these very persistent leading edge technologies. And then from there, once you have the information, artificial intelligence can intervene and be helpful by discerning malign behavior, being able to figure out it's the needle in the haystack. If you took a look today from the overhead image of the number of ships operating in just the Arabian Gulf, it's somewhere around 5,000-ish. A human being simply cannot pick out one or two ships in there. But using artificial intelligence, as we've proven, can be done. So our goal is to distribute this network and operate it with our partners, multilaterally and bilaterally. And I think by doing so, we will take today's existing regional cooperation, which is already strong, and move it to the next level. With that, let me just talk to you for just a moment about what today's cooperation looks like in practical terms. So I'm very proud that today the United States leads two large regional coalitions. One is called the Combined Maritime Force, one is called the International Maritime Security Construct. The Combined Maritime Force was established just after 9/11. It consisted of 11 nations. Today, it's 34 nations, the latest of whom to join is India, just a few months ago. And we're focused in 4 regions of the Middle East with 4 task forces. The first task force focuses on counter-smuggling in the North Arabian Sea and Gulf of Oman. It is today led by a Saudi officer. The next task force focuses on counter-piracy throughout the region. It is today led by Brazil, which really reflects the global nature of this coalition. The third task force focuses on maritime security inside the Arabian Gulf. It is led by Bahrain. And you'd say, well, they probably do this all the time. It's actually the first time in more than a decade that Bahrain has led it. And then we have a newly established task force focused on maritime security in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden for all the regions that most of us can appreciate. It's today led by the United States, and a month from now will be led by Egypt for their first leadership role in an international coalition in a very long time. So we're very excited about that. That's the first group doing terrific work every day, and this 34-nation partnership is the largest maritime partnership in the world, and when you start counting the nations, it's a larger partnership than NATO, very influential. The second partnership, the International Maritime Security Construct, is better known by its tactical name of Task Force Sentinel, was established in the summer of 2019 after a series of Iranian attacks a little east of here in the Strait of Hormuz. You probably recall this in the news. It has a mission of both deterring attack and reassuring partners and the commercial shipping industry. When it was initially established, 4 countries were members. Today, it's 10, and as of this morning, I'm getting word there might be 11 or 12. So that's fantastic. It gives you another sense of where cooperation is growing and what that looks like in the future. So I think it's exciting. 2 large coalitions, U.S.-led, but the people doing the real work down at the sea level, if you will, are our international partners and allies, and they're doing terrific work. If I just went off an excursion, talked about the counter-smuggling group that's led by a Saudi commodore. They're on track to set a record for the most drug interdictions that we've had since this organization was established some 20 years ago. So I think that speaks to both proficiency, knowledge, and the great interoperability and cooperation we enjoy at a very high level. So with that, I hope I painted the picture that we have quite an optimistic view of where our partnerships are today, where they offer opportunities in maritime security, as well as what the future looks like. And I believe it hinges very squarely on taking the partnerships that we have and strengthening them, taking this new technology and accelerating as fast as we can, teaming back with our partners, getting at sea, putting more eyes out on the water to enhance our deterrence and their ability to respond when there is an issue. So thanks so much, and I look forward to the Q&A. Much appreciated.
Admiral, thank you very much for your remarks. We have been looking today at the big picture of what does security look like and what steps can the United States and our partners take to help provide security for the people, the countries of the region. From your seat in Bahrain as NAVCENT commander, what does security look like, and how do you prioritize the threats to security that you have to deal with?
Well, if I could just broadly, talk through what are my security concerns, I would first say that any destabilizing activity on the sea and the maritime in this region is a concern. On one end, human trafficking, piracy, smuggling, whether it's drugs or weapons, and certainly any kinetic activity, as we've seen in the last couple of days, all concerns. More broadly and more specifically, it probably goes without saying, but worth saying, the number one security concern is Iran, and that manifests in several different ways. The first is their rapid growth and in both capability and numbers of ballistic missiles, rapid growth and capability and numbers of their unmanned aerial vehicles, and rapid growth and capability of cruise missiles. The second element would be the use of proxies and the vast proliferation of the things I described as the first point. And the third point, obviously, would be the nuclear component, which our diplomats are dealing with right now. And I think the logical question is, well, then what are you doing about it? I believe, and I'll go back to the points of my remarks, I think the best things that we can do are take the coalitions that we have today, double down on them and expand them. We're doing that. And then take the technology advantage that we have, double down, accelerate that, and we're doing that. I think that puts us in the best position from a security perspective.
So what we've seen over the course of the past several years is maybe less of a focus in the United States by successive presidents in continued real involvement in security issues in the Gulf, and maybe consequently, maybe independently, a reevaluation by governments in the Gulf of their security relationships with the United States. Where do you see that picture now? You've painted a very optimistic picture about the partnership involving new technologies with American leadership that seems to cut against what looks like a broader trend at the political level. How do you see NAVCENT, naval maritime cooperation, building confidence, or do you even disagree with my basic premise?
Yeah, I have a little bit of a different perspective in that for a couple of reasons. But first, we're pretty clear-eyed on regional perspective of the United States and our commitment. But from my perspective, as we've heard our Secretary of Defense, as we've heard the President say, we're committed to the region. I think you have to act. You have to show that commitment through action, not words. It just can't be something you talk about. So what does that look like, for the United States Navy in maritime security? I think the signal is very clear. So in 2021, we conducted about 30 exercises with regional partners. Oh, by the way, China conducted 1, to give you a comparison. Russia conducted 3. There's one data point for you there on level of commitment. So 30 last year. By next week, we will have conducted 70 this year. So we've more than doubled from the previous commitment. I go back to deeds, not words. We led the largest international exercise in the world earlier this year. Deeds, not words. Our coalitions that we're leading here are expanding. Thus, I mentioned India joining coalitions. Seychelles has also joined. Romania has joined. And my guess is if we were to have this conversation 6 months from now, I bet we have 5 to 10 more countries joining. So I think those things all speak to commitment, how you back it up, what are you doing on a daily basis. That's one element. And then also, what are the results? Because I think the results matter. If I just talk about smuggling for just a second, which has long been an issue here in the region, both from drugs and weapons. I'll talk drugs first. In 2021, we seized about $500 million worth of drugs, and which was more than the 4 previous years combined. This year, we're on track to equal that. So over a 2-year period, $1 billion of seizures at local cost is quite a haul. On the weapons side, last year we seized about 9,000 weapons, which was 3 times more than the previous year. 9,000 weapons, out with any country, any proxy out here, it's a lot of weapons, plus all the ammunition associated with this. Earlier this year, we worked with the UK and seized cruise missile components, ballistic missile components, and then just this last weekend, as you probably saw in the news, we seized both an explosive precursor and explosives that are used for ammonium perchlorate, which is used to fuel ballistic missiles. So these are tangible, meaningful signs of the commitment. And I think that continues. I don't see any change in that very strong trajectory going forward.
It's clear that NAVCENT and CENTCOM want to continue the U.S. leadership and the strong partnerships in maritime security. Do you see other countries in the world who have the ambition at some point in the future to take on a similar role, either here or elsewhere? You mentioned one Chinese exercise, 3 Russian exercises. Is there intent among these countries to expand their navies, to be more influential? And how long would it take them to develop the capability to do that if that was one of their intents?
Well, if there's one thing I've learned in this job is don't try to forecast things, except for I will forecast that the United States will beat Iran in the World Cup on the 29th. I will forecast that. That's it. But what I will tell you just from a factual perspective, there's no indication that there's going to be another country who steps up in the leadership role that I think we all expect us to play, and that I think that we would all agree is necessary to continue these very strong coalitions.
So when many of my friends in the Gulf talk about maritime security, they're really thinking about the Gulf. They're talking about protecting tankers carrying crude oil in and out of the Strait of Hormuz. You drew a much broader picture. Can you explain to us how you differentiate what NAVCENT does in the Gulf, in the Arabian Sea, in the Gulf of Aden, around the Bab el-Mandeb and in the Red Sea, and how the missions change and how the threats are different in different parts of this environment?
Yeah, sure. If I walked counterclockwise, so if I started in the Red Sea, for the better part of all our adult lifetime, the Red Sea has largely been quiet. We've gone decades and not heard a peep out of the Red Sea, and that simply is not the case today. The southern Red Sea, in particular, is at risk because of Houthi activities. I think this is well documented. There is risk in and around the Bab el-Mandeb, through which 15 to 20% of global trade will pass through. So for obvious reasons, maintaining maritime security in that region is a focus. It has not always been the case, but it is today. And this is why we stood up this new task force about 6 months ago to really focus on that. So that's one element. As I work my way a little further east, now you start to get into the Gulf of Aden and counter-piracy and the prevalence of piracy that was so vibrant, unfortunately vibrant, about a decade ago, has now largely ceased. For a variety of reasons, not the least of which is we have a very vibrant deterrent that exists, both from our perspective and a very strong integration with European Union forces, and economic factors in East Africa for sure, which we'll have to keep our eye on because that is a factor that could rear their ugly head. If I continue around counterclockwise, it really is a counter-smuggling effort in the North Arabian Sea and Gulf of Oman. As is well documented, generally the smuggling starts in Iran, travels through several different paths down into Yemen. This has been the case for the better part of the last 7 years. And then, of course, there's the Strait of Hormuz and its own security. Presence is is how we operate on a daily basis, and with a deterrent posture, in particular using the Task Force Sentinel that I described. And then further up in the Arabian Gulf, we have a large presence, actually, of partner nation navies from the western point of the Strait of Hormuz all the way to the North Arabian Gulf. In particular, I'd highlight the recent resurrection of U.S., Kuwait, and Iraq working together in the North Arabian Gulf to essentially try to box out or at least maintain stability there in light of the IRGCN activity. So that's kind of the broad framing of where everything is. Intermingled in that is one of the threats that I talked about today, is an expansion of Iranian UAV activity that has grown by orders of magnitude in just about the last 5 to 6 years. Those Iranians have UAVs flying out over international waters every single day. And so our interaction with them is every single day. And the overwhelming majority of these is safe and professional. So that's the kind of environment that we're operating on a day-to-day basis, status quo.
So let me ask one last question before we turn this to the audience for questions. You talked about one particular threat from UAVs by Iran. Can you explain the variety of threats that Iran poses and the kind of incidents that you see in NAVCENT forces or partner forces in this operating area? What kinds of things do the Iranians do regularly, and how do you deal with that as commander of the forces and as advisor to our partner forces?
Sure. I'll just walk back about 2 weeks I think to give you a snapshot of activity in the region for those who haven't watched all the news. So we've seen Iranian ballistic missile attacks into northern Iraq. You've seen the news about a potential of attacks into Saudi Arabia. I think you've seen our recent seizure of a dhow with a very large volume of explosives. And then the night before last, I think you've seen now, we've confirmed an Iranian UAV attack against a Liberian merchant ship. That's in about the last 10 to 14 days. I think that's generally indicative of the environment that we're in right now. And I wouldn't talk about how we're dealing with it or what we're doing about it, other than to say our continued presence and working together as partners is central to dealing with the challenge that we're facing.
Okay, thank you. I invite the audience now to ask questions. Ambassador Wisner.
Struck by the fact that there is widespread public view that the United States is in retreat, that we are pulling back from the region, and that nations in this region need to look to their own devices to find strategic autonomy and an ability to survive in a competitive world. The story you tell today is very positive in terms of demonstrable proof of American commitment and even more of American capability to stand by our alliances and continue to make a difference in this region. But the question I put to you is, how are we making your statement credible in political terms? How are we signaling what is capacity to the audiences of this region to enhance confidence in the quality of the relationship?
Yes, sir. Well, first, thank you for the question, and for you in particular, thank you for your wonderful lifetime of service that we all fully recognize. Yeah, there's the policy component of what we're doing, which I think is well established, and I think that the most direct answer I can give is it's all about our actions, and I think that we have to continue to press the accelerator and remain very engaged as the leaders in throughout the region, and at the same time work very closely with our partners and help develop their both capacity and capability. I'll use UAE as a great example. I had a CNN interview 6 months ago, and one of the first things I said is the United Arab Emirates has a highly, highly capable military, very capable and eminently capable of both defending themselves. And the question is now, how do we work with them to enhance that on a daily basis, which we're certainly doing. So I think we find ourselves in a position where many of the nations in the regions have exquisite capability. I'll use Saudi Arabia and their own air defense capability. I mean, they've employed it 300 or 400 times in the last couple of years, shooting down a variety of ballistic missiles. They're probably one of the most proficient in the world. And so I think the question then becomes, how do we take nations with this exquisite capability, advanced capability, that may well not be understood if you look through things from a lens of 10, I'd even say 5 or 10 years ago, work with those countries in a way that's meaningful for the country and advance the relationship. From the maritime side, we have a very clear perspective on this. The ripe opportunity is using these new unmanned surface vessels as an example, because every country can see the value. I'll use Bahrain, but I could use any country. If today any country in the region can effectively see 30 kilometers off their coast using the existing sensor network, it's not hard to imagine how you could put a drone out a little further, control it from a satellite, put a radar and a camera on it, a very sophisticated one, and then I'll take 30 kilometers and make it 60. And then you put another drone out there and you make it, instead of 60 kilometers, it's 90. So with a very modest investment in cooperation, you've now taken your ability to see what's happening off your coast from 30 to 90 kilometers, essentially overnight, for pennies on the dollar. So I think these are the areas we can find to work together that are mutually beneficial. And so that's really where we're focused today.
Thank you. My question is actually an extension of that, and it relates to the Navy's involvement in public diplomacy. So there's a general perception in the public, maybe not so much in the elite, that America is withdrawing. So historically, the US Navy, when it had the White Ship based in Bahrain, it would travel around from the 40s to the 80s. Coastal communities were well aware of the US presence because of this public diplomacy. So my question today, is, what is the emphasis that the Naval Forces Central Command is putting on public diplomacy to demonstrate the enduring commitment to the area rather than these more military capability dimensions to illustrate the presence?
No, that's a wonderful question. I'll just walk around the Arabian Peninsula over the last 8 or 9 months. We've had a series of ship visits in Kuwait that were focused on nothing other than community outreach and bringing people together in a meaningful way through this naval public diplomacy, if you will. We routinely do the same thing in Bahrain. We've done it in Saudi Arabia. We've certainly done it here on several occasions. Our ships have had probably 80 port visits in Oman this year, offering an opportunity for our sailors, men and women, to get into the community and have reciprocity with the community getting to know us. Just 6 or 8 weeks ago, we had a wonderful visit to Karachi. It's our 10th ship visit here in about the last year. I think we had about 2 in the previous 3 or 4 years. That was, again, focused on public diplomacy. Similarly, if I walk down the coast, we've had a number of visits in newly opened up opportunities in Berenice, Egypt, brand spanking new base. Fascinating little tidbit. I've never seen a new Navy base in my entire 5,000 years in the Navy, but I've seen 2 of them in this tour, both of them in Egypt. Fascinating relationship. We're doing the same thing in Jeddah and certainly in Aqaba and up in Eilat, Israel. So I think what you describe continues to be alive. Perhaps we don't talk about it as much, and we don't have a big white ship. Of course, we haven't had the white ship for about 20 years. But now that I think about it, maybe we should paint one of our ships white and just sail it around. There's about 10 sailors who are going to hear this sometime tonight and go, uh-oh, I wonder if he's talking about us painting my ship white. So we'll see what happens with it. But that's where we are. So it's, that's kind of the micro. In the macro sense, we're very mindful of it. And I think one of the best things that we can do is to continue this public diplomacy, which did get put on hold during COVID, for sure. But to revitalize it is something we've been focused on. It's a good two-way street. It's good for our sailors in 3 ways. Good for our country, and I think it's good for the host countries as well to get to know us in a meaningful way.
You mentioned the attack, I think it was a drone attack on the Liberian tanker, which is reported in the news to have been owned by an Israeli private owner. I don't know if the attack in the Iranian mine was linked to Israel or not, but they have a... What does this mark, in your view, a return to Iranian attacks on shipping in the Sea of Oman and the Arabian Sea? And what can be done to deter that? Thank you.
You're right. So this was 2 nights ago. It's now confirmed. It was a one-way attack UAV that flew into the stern of the ship, fortunately causing minimal damage in this particular case, although it's a oil tanker, so it could have caused enormous damage. This is the second such attack since last summer, although it has been since July of 2021, when you may recall that the Mercer Street was struck, in which 2 of its crew were killed. What it signals, we'll have to see. I think the response will be one where there's a policy component of what the response will be. For sure, I would anticipate that there would be something of an international coalition nature to it. But I think we'll have to see what that looks like in the future. But the fact is, it did happen. It's not the first time. It's a demonstrated capability. The capability certainly is not going anywhere, but increasing. And so it's an area, as I mentioned earlier, in the list of concerns, it's at the top of the list, for sure.
Thank you very much again for painting this very positive, practical view of what's the relationship. My question has to do with the area called the Indo-Pacific strategic area. Now, the Arab Gulf states, which is the Arabian Peninsula, has got access to the Arabian Sea, and that makes them part of this area. What does that mean in terms of cooperation when it comes to maritime security and also naval? Thank you.
Yeah, I think I always defer to individual countries and what it may mean to them. the cooperation. But from my perspective, because we have decades-long strategic relationships with the nations, if I just use the GCC nations for an example, we have a very strong foundation to build on. We're past building it. We're operating from a maritime security perspective, and so this is this foundation is what we've looked to seize on. In terms of what individual countries we do relative to the Pacific, that's always a bit. This goes back to my. I tend not to make forecasts except on football games, but I'm optimistic that the shared interest in maritime security will keep us together, particularly in light of the threats that we face today. I think that's probably the best I could give you right now. And I think we're clear-eyed of influences that come from the Pacific, certainly on the economic perspective. But if I look at it from just a military perspective, there's really no comparison of the level of our engagement, there's 70 exercises to China doing 1. That's a complete imbalance. So I like where we are, and I like the friendships and partnerships that we have today. But I think it's important that we recognize we have to work at it every single day. But we have a great foundation to build on.
AGSIW. In your estimation, what are the biggest risks associated with unmanned systems? You talked about them very positively, but what makes you worried when you work to bring these systems online? Thank you.
Yeah, not much, actually. And here's why. Over the last year, we've accrued about 25,000 hours of operating experience. And if you just say, well, 25,000, I'm not sure what that means. Translate that into something. So that's 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, for 12 years. That's a lot of operating experience. So during that time, we've been able to work out kinks, and I'll give you a couple of myth busters just to help ease any concerns that these unmanned surface vessels are a threat somehow to international shipping. Not at all. As you might expect, we don't sit them right in the middle of an international shipping lane. We offset them. We've never even had a incident remotely close to any sort of collision. They're also quite small, and 7 to 11 meters, hardly in comparison to a 300-meter supertanker. The second piece is the autonomy associated with them is very mature. Our ability to reposition them is mature. We're soon to get another version of the systems that we have. Sail drones are probably the most common for a variety of reasons. We can talk about that. We'll be able to reposition a little bit faster. Our team, and these always operate in a manned-unmanned teaming. Very rarely do we have them out alone and unafraid. There's usually a manned ship within some distance that we tend not to talk about. It's in some proximity to be able to operate. So that was a long way of saying I really don't have concerns. Now, a year ago, I had concerns because the technology was so new. But these days, we've operated them so much. They have incredible endurance. So we had two drones operating in the Red Sea for 220 days, straight at sea. That'd be impossible on a manned ship. And by the way, 220 days with no maintenance downtime, which is also almost unfathomable. I might also note, on a light note, that we haven't got a single complaint from anyone on an unmanned ship. So that's kind of nice. There's a lot of morale on these unmanned ships. Makes me feel good. Yeah, so I think we find ourselves in a good position. And importantly, our partner nations see the value. We've already had Bahrain and Kuwait commit to acquiring their own systems. We're just at the infancy of this process. This goes to growing the 100 USVs. And I think it's easy to see when you have 100 of these vessels operating around the Middle East, we're just going to be in a better position to understand what's happening around us.
But it seems to me that your ability to put together a common operating picture, your digital ocean, is one of the strongest things that you can bring to a partnership with our friends in the Gulf. So maybe looking a little bit, not predicting, but looking forward, how do you think this concept of using unmanned sea vehicles will expand globally. You've got experience in other operating venues, especially Pacific Command. Is this an example that the Navy can draw on to use with friends and partners elsewhere in the Mediterranean, in Europe, South China Sea? Where do you think this might go in the future?
Yeah, I think that everything that we're doing in this region as a test bed and prototyping has applicability globally. And it's actually a focus of ours. So when you talk about maneuvering, as we did, 2 drones from Aqaba, Jordan, autonomously down to the Saudi islands, 2,000 miles, there's no difference in that, and maneuvering 2 drones autonomously among the Philippine archipelago, or in and around in any strait. You pick the strait or South China Sea. I could apply the same thing up in the Baltic, Black Sea, you name it, a large number of bodies. So everything that we're doing, while we are applying it here in the Middle East, actually has very practical application in every other theater in the world. And I think that's been very helpful.
Are there roles for our partners in the Gulf and in the Middle East in expansion of these technologies and these concepts in other parts of the world?
Well, that'll be their choice. I certainly think there could be. If I just use some examples of what that looks like, here I see the UK, who obviously has significant presence here in this region. They've used this technology. They're side by side. Actually, in this organization called Task Force 59, by January, the deputy commander is going to be a Royal Navy officer. We're going to have at least 5, if not 7, members of the staff who are from regional nations, and in this case, European nations. I suspect that expands. So I think what you'll see is countries contributing in the near term with staff members, and as they look to their own future, they'll be able to, since we're on the leading edge of this, discern for themselves what aspect of this is something that I can replicate and I want to bring back to the Baltic, the North Sea, the Adriatic, you kind of name it. So I think it lays that framework.
We have time for one final question. Bill. Ambassador Roebuck.
Admiral, thank you very much for that brilliant presentation. Really enjoyed it. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your assessment of the capabilities of Gulf nations' developments of their Navy, and what role is NAVCENT, Fifth Fleet playing in helping them strengthen those individual nation capabilities on the naval front?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, the good news is every nation in the region is moving forward. That's fantastic, and we're working with them in a variety of ways. I'll give you just a couple of recent examples. So it wasn't more than 2 weeks ago where we had newly acquired Saudi Arabia acquired U.S. MH-60 Romeo Seahawk helicopters. These are the same helicopters that we fly off our destroyers and cruisers around the world. Saudi Arabia has 10. We just had the first group of them conduct basic landing qualifications on our ships. Fantastic. What a wonderful demonstration of interoperability. That's one example. Bahrain similarly has acquired their own patrol boats from us, operating side by side. When I see them at sea, I can't tell you if they're American or Bahraini until you get up close enough to see the flag. So I think that's another good sign. UAE, lots of examples of working interoperability on a Navy that's growing both particularly in capability and also in size. The exercise that we did called Iron Defender probably had 20 examples of us doing interoperable pieces. And then following the attacks back in January and February, we had an Emirati officer on our guided missile destroyer sitting right off here at the coast, sitting side by side with a lead tactical controller. That just would not have been even imaginable, some number of years ago. And I would apply the same general concepts with Oman and Kuwait, moving in a good direction, a lot of good interoperability. And at the risk of sounding like I'm overly optimistic, and I am an optimistic person, I think all these are signs of things moving in the right direction, but we have to keep at it. I think that's the key feature for us.
I'll ask you one final question. It's sort of a difficult one because you've described a system of partnership, leadership that has the United States at its center with a lot of partners around us. Do you envision a day when this coordinating role with the United States is no longer as necessary or no longer necessary at all, at least in sort of the Red Sea, the Arabian Sea, and the Gulf?
Well, I think today, in some cases by necessity, in many cases by desire, and mostly by desire, there is a desire that the United States continues to lead in a meaningful way. I think that then manifests in asking the question, well, how do we do that? I think through large coalitions, that's helpful. At the end of the day, our presence brings deterrence, which brings maritime security, which increases the free flow of commerce, which is good for the regional economy. I think when you break it down, that's what we're able to bring here. We're also at the same time hardly the only actor. It is very much a shared responsibility. I use the example of all the countries who command the variety of task forces. That's just a few. When I sit in every Tuesday, we have a morning, either Monday or Tuesday, we have a morning coalition brief. As I sit in our headquarters and I look out, we have representatives from 29 countries sitting there. It's a pretty remarkable assembly of talent and countries who are focused on maritime security. They don't have to be there. It's all voluntary. And so I'm optimistic that the coalescing of that level of interest serves us well today and certainly gives a framework for the future that will allow us to continue to be the centerpiece as desired, but lots of other countries obviously increasing their capability and capacity, not the least of whom is UAE, who has a very considerable presence at the headquarters doing great work.
Admiral, on behalf of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and today in Abu Dhabi, thank you for joining us. Thank you for telling us about the developments and the partnership. Thank you for joining us today. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Sir, thanks for the kind invitation.